On a scale of 1 to 10, how consequential was President Trump's announcement on Monday about supplying weapons to Ukraine?
I'd say maybe a 6 or 7. You could twist my arm and convince me to go as high as 8, I guess. This was certainly an unexpected turnaround. There's more certainly that the U.S. can and should be doing to support Ukraine, but to have Trump do anything to support Ukraine is a significant new development, even if he is selling the weapons to Europe and not donating them, which is something that we should be doing, I think.
I'm slightly less positive than Max is on this. I'd put it at a solid 6. I'm less surprised that President Trump is willing to allow America's closest friends to spend money on American weapons and provide them to Ukraine. I think what is more consequential is that President Trump's willing to give NATO a formal role in this, which President Biden wasn't willing to do. I am less persuaded than Max is that this is a turning point in President Trump's attitude about President Putin. I'm skeptical.
This is Impromptu from Washington Post Opinions, a show that brings you conversations about the news we can't stop thinking about. I'm Damir Marusic, an assignment editor at The Post. And this week, we're talking about the latest in the Ukraine war. After much buildup, President Trump announced yesterday that the U.S. will start selling major weapons to NATO to give to Ukraine. In a very Trumpian move, he also said he'd smack enormous tariffs on Russia if they can't reach a deal to end the war in 50 days. How much does this reveal a shift in direction for Trump on dealing with Russia? And does it actually change anything about the trajectory of the war? And as the war drags into its third year, what will it take to actually end it? I'm joined by two experts and colleagues to get into all of this.
I'm Max Boot. I'm a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and a national security columnist for the Washington Post.
I'm Kori Schake. I lead the Foreign and Defense Policy team at the American Enterprise Institute.
Excellent. So what was your reaction when you were listening to Trump at the press conference? Was it a bigger or smaller deal than you expected, Kori?
It was a bigger deal than I expected, and I was positively impressed by the way NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte has figured out how to cajole President Trump into better outcomes than I think many of us expected.
Yeah, no, I think this was a bigger deal than I expected because although Trump has been saying more skeptical and critical things about Putin for several months now, it had been in the realm of rhetoric. He hadn't backed it up with any kind of action. And on Monday, you saw him backing it up with action, which surprised me. And one of the other things that also surprised me was, to Kori's point, how warmly Trump spoke about our NATO allies, given his longstanding skepticism of NATO as well. I mean, such that John Bolton, his former national security advisor, had predicted that Trump could pull out of NATO in this term. And instead, he was seeming to embrace NATO. That's also a big turnaround that hasn't perhaps received the attention that it deserves.
So let me ask you both then, how much do you think this is the result of, our allies learning to speak Trump's language more? Or how much is it that this is a real sea change in Trump's relationship with Putin? I mean, 3 years ago, he called him a genius when he first invaded Ukraine. And now there's a real sense of frustration. I mean, is it both and? What do you think's going on here?
I think it's both and. I think the NATO summit that happened a month or so ago is really consequential because, Mark Rutte was Dutch prime minister for 14 years, and he had to run a kaleidoscope of political parties in coalition. And I think that's the essential skill that we're seeing. And he must have had to hold his nose for a lot of the things he was saying, but he did it so that the NATO allies, the leaders who actually have to face their domestic publics, didn't have to. And he managed to turn a key in a lock that got President Trump committing to the big magic number of 5% defense spending, 1.5% of which is going to be building bridges and reinforcing the Autobahn. But those are not inconsequential additions. And the 3.5% commitment is what NATO war plans will require for the defense of the allies. So they did a really good job. And I think it showed in the way that President Trump is all of a sudden in love with NATO allies, right? Mm-hmm. Which one of the consistent themes in in Trump rhetoric since the 1980s is the belief that allies are a burden on the U.S. And that sea change, I think, enabled the sending of weapons to Ukraine because the Ukraine war does feel existential for many of our European allies.
Mm. But Max, you identified also a sea change, I think, in his attitude towards Putin, specifically a rising sense of frustration. Thoughts on that? What's changed there, and how consequential do you think it is?
I think Trump came into office with this delusional idea that because he and Putin were such great friends, Putin would just end the war in Ukraine as a sign of friendship to Donald Trump. And obviously, no serious analyst believed that for a minute. And it's almost remarkable that Trump, who had been president before, believed this fairy tale. And I think you can look at the last 6 months as the process of dispelling this illusion because, he's tried to sweet talk Putin, and Putin has basically given him nothing in return, making clear that Russia will continue fighting until it achieves its maximalist objectives, which I think it's never going to achieve, but Putin was not in a mood to make any compromises. And it's basically, I think, taken 6 months for the scales to fall from Trump's eyes. And he's repeatedly expressed frustration with Putin that they have, quote unquote, nice phone calls, but then the next night Putin goes and bombs Kiev or does something else awful. And so finally, I think what turned Trump around was this notion that Putin was playing him for a sucker, and he doesn't want to be the mark in the deal. He wants to be the guy who's pulling the strings. He doesn't want to be the patsy. And I think he probably concluded that he was being the patsy in his dealing with Putin, and he wanted to make clear, don't mess around with me.
So one thing, if I may, I worry that we might be over-torquing to the change. And I think it's important to baseline any Trump administration assessment, especially any assessment of the president, that his policies aren't necessarily going to be linear. The fact that he's made one change doesn't mean he's not going to reverse himself, doesn't mean he's not going to abandon Ukraine, does not mean he's not going to get frustrated with allies, or that Putin will call him up and, I don't know, offer him a hotel someplace in Russia, and that will change President Trump's mind again. So I think we need to be cautious not to view the Trump administration policies as unidirectional.
No, I think that's a really good point, Kori. The question then is also about what exactly has been promised. We'll talk, I think, a little bit about the weapons later on, but the main threat here seems to be, like many solutions that Trump offers to the world's problems, it's a threat of 100% tariffs on Russian goods. And then also secondary 100% tariffs on other countries that buy Russian oil and gas. How credible do you think those threats are? And can they make a difference if he does go through with it, never mind whether he does or not?
I mean, I don't regard those threats as super credible, as I think that's true with most market analysts. And you saw the Russian stock market actually rising in the wake of the Trump announcement. I think just because there's a lot of skepticism that Trump is actually going to impose 100% tariffs on trade with India, with China, with Turkey, with South Korea, with other countries that are buying Russian oil and gas. That's also the problem with the Lindsey Graham, Richard Blumenthal legislation, which has like 85 co-sponsors in the Senate, because it would impose 500% tariffs, and it would basically blow up the global trade system unless those countries completely cut off Russia, which is probably not that realistic. But I think there's a lot he can do in terms of other tariffs and other means of putting pressure on Russia that don't involve these massive and probably unrealistic tariffs. I mean, you can, for example, tighten existing sanctions, go after more Russian banks, go after more Russian companies, go after their shadow fleet of tankers. And the big thing, which was completely absent from the discussion yesterday, which I'm going to, bang my drum about, is the $300 billion in frozen Russian assets in the West, including, and I think this is really important, this is something that people don't realize, according to Phil Zelikow and other prominent former government officials, the amount of frozen Russian assets under U.S. control is not $5 billion, which was the figure put out by the Biden Treasury. They're saying it's actually $50 billion, 50. That is a ton of money. Using that money to support Ukraine, could be truly a game changer in this conflict.
I think Max is exactly right. We don't import much from Russia. So it's a secondary sanctions threat. But those countries may be paying 100% tariffs anyway because of Trump tariff policy. So I think the chaos premium we are all paying in a Trump administration devalues the deterrent effect of tariff threats. It's also not clear to me that the asymmetric use of economic levers to try and coerce or compel a country that's committed its army to warfare is actually all that effective. I mean, I remember President Biden saying at the start of Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine that economic sanctions were going to be just as consequential as the use of military force. And it turns out they're a lot less consequential than the use of military force because economies are very adaptive. And something the Germans have done, I think, really importantly opened a door to a way to be much more forceful in sanctioning Russia, which is relaxing the restraints on Ukraine's ability to strike weapons factories and military bases deep inside Russian territory.
Well, there's a lot more to discuss. We're going to talk about how these moves are playing back here in the United States and what actually can be done to end this war, as you said, Kori. But we'll do that right after the break. Welcome back. I'm Damir Marusic, and this is Impromptu. So during his campaign, Trump promised to end the war in Ukraine on day one. But even more broadly, he's always criticized entanglements overseas and touted an America-first approach. Do you think deciding to continue to arm Ukraine, even in this roundabout way by selling weapons to allies, is a betrayal for his America-first base? How do you think this is going to play?
I don't think it's a betrayal because I don't think they have a particularly well-developed conceptualization of what America first means. Moreover, I think as we have seen with other issues, President Trump's charisma and his political power to pull his supporters along for policies that they might otherwise oppose. I think we saw that with the passage of the so-called Big Beautiful Bill legislation, right? There were a lot of debt-concerned Republicans who nonetheless voted for it because they supported the president. So no, I don't think it's particularly betrayal. Moreover, it would be much worse for the Trump presidency for Ukraine to fail. Not only would it increase what the U.S. has to spend for our own defense, but it would fracture the security of Europe. And so it could be his version of the Afghanistan withdrawal. So I think there are lots of good reasons, in addition to the best reasons, which is supporting people fighting so ardently for their own liberty.
Max, do you agree with that? You know, I personally was struck by the reaction and the sort of nasty fights inside the administration around the Iran intervention when Trump decided to actually strike in Iran. But, you know, as Kori said, he did manage to pull his party along. Is this similar in any way? What are you seeing?
You know, I think there's always been this incoherence in terms of Trump's foreign policy because on the one hand, he says, we want to be strong, nobody will mess with us. On the other hand, he wants to be seen as a peacemaker, not a warmonger. And in fact, in his inaugural address, he talked about how he wanted his success to be measured by the wars that he ends and the wars he doesn't get into. And so there's always that tension. And so there are hawkish or more bellicose elements of the Trump coalition. There are also more dovish and isolationist elements of the Trump coalition. And I would say right now he's clearly leaning into the hawkish camp, and the dovish camp, which is the Tucker Carlsons and people like that, are feeling betrayed by his strikes on Iran, by his now embrace of Ukraine. There's also other stuff, you know, Jeffrey Epstein, other stuff out there, which is roiling MAGA land right now. But I mean, I fundamentally agree with Kori. This is not going to be the crack up of the Trump coalition because it's really all about him. And at the end of the day, they will follow him wherever he may lead. But clearly, this is causing some cognitive dissonance for substantial elements of the MAGA base.
So we know that the deal will include sophisticated defensive weapons, Patriot batteries for Ukraine, but it's not yet clear whether it will provide long-range offensive weapons that could strike to Moscow or St. Petersburg. There's been some reporting this morning, as we're recording on Tuesday, that Trump pointedly asked Zelensky whether he could strike Moscow and St. Petersburg. Do you think that that's the next step, that we should be supporting and supplying the kind of weapons to NATO to give to Ukraine to strike into Moscow and St. Petersburg? What do you guys think?
Absolutely. We are forcing the Ukrainians to fight a war where we have given Russia sanctuary and enabled them to strike civilian targets in Ukraine. So, two kinds of asymmetry. One, Russia has sanctuary that Ukraine doesn't. And second, Ukraine isn't hitting civilian targets in Russia. Russia's hitting civilian targets in Ukraine. And I think forcing Russia to run the risks of both of those constraints being relaxed is actually the right way to up the pressure on Putin for the terror he is imposing on Ukrainians.
I disagree slightly. I don't think that the Ukrainians should be striking civilian targets in Russia. I think that they should continue to abide by the rules of war, even though Russia is not. And more fundamentally, I don't think that attacks on civilian targets on cities, I don't think that's a war-winning tactic. I mean, I'm sure Kori would agree. If you look back at the history of strategic bombing going back to World War II, the populations under attack tend to coalesce around their leaders rather than to decide to surrender when they're under attack. But what I do think is important is, and I agree with Kori to this extent, I think it is important to take off some of the limitations on the use of U.S.-provided weaponry so that Ukraine can strike deeper into Russia against airfields, against oil facilities, against supply depots, against all the things that supply the Russian war effort, including factories where these drones are being produced. I think those are legitimate military targets, and Ukraine should have the freedom to strike not only with their own homemade drones, but with Western-provided weapon systems as well.
So just to be clear, I'm not arguing Ukraine should attack Moscow or other civilian targets, but I am saying Russia should have to worry about that because we are imposing rules on Ukraine that Russia is not abiding by. And the Russians having to worry about it, I think, will change how they fight the war. But I agree with Max that Ukraine has an important moral advantage because they are not targeting civilians.
So as we sort of wrap up here, I'm constantly reminded, I think General David Petraeus asks, tell me how this ends when talking about Afghanistan. I'd pose that same question to the two of you. We're no longer in that period of cautious optimism ahead of the Ukrainian counteroffensive, where the talk was of Russia being completely defeated on the battlefield. How do you see this ending at this point, given the best possible outcome of the sea change in Trump's attitude?
I think the only way this war ends is when Russia loses. You know, it's fashionable to say military force can't solve problems. But I think given the incompatibility of Russian and Ukrainian political goals, the only way this war ends is if somebody wins and somebody loses. I'm trying to persuade myself that the Russian summer offensive that's coming is the equivalent of the German offensive in 1918 during World War I, where they know that American forces flowing into the theater in 1918 were going to make the German war effort unsupportable. And I very much hope that the Russian anticipated offensive for this summer is Putin calculating that the West is limbering up for greater support to Ukraine, and the million casualties that Russia has taken make their war effort unsustainable. But I think that's a pretty optimistic interpretation so far. The sand is running through the hourglass for both Ukraine and Russia. And I think the decisions President Trump and NATO allies have taken in the last month or so do give cause to believe that Ukraine can hang in there longer than Russia can hang in there. And I think it will be important not to negotiate a ceasefire or a peace agreement that simply allows Russia to buy time and recommence this effort in a couple of years.
Max, earlier you said Russia can't win. Can Ukraine win, you think?
I mean, I think Ukraine can win in terms of remaining a sovereign, democratic, independent state. I don't know if they're going to be able to win back the 20% of their territory that Russia has occupied anytime soon. But it is, in a manner of speaking, I think Ukraine is already winning. I mean, as anybody who's traveled to Ukraine knows, the country continues to function, even though they're facing this horrific onslaught and people are having to deal with air raids and all these horrible things. Nevertheless, Kiev is crowded. People are going about their business. Businesses are functioning. The government is functioning. It's still a liberal democracy. So it is winning, and basically preserving that, I think, is a victory. I think the war ends when Putin concludes that he will not achieve his objectives at gunpoint. And his objective, of course, is to subjugate Ukraine to Russian domination. And he has not achieved that so far, in the 3.5 years of war. And I think he still thinks there's a window of opportunity for him to achieve that. But to Kori's point, assuming the Ukrainians defeat the Russian summer offensive, and I don't see any reason to assume that they won't, then Putin in the fall could face a very changed landscape, because he was hoping that Ukraine would be cut off from U.S. aid, that the Europeans would not step into the breach. And all those assumptions right now are not really holding up, I would say. And so I think Putin I can't speak for the guy, and he's, clearly unhinged to some extent on the subject of Ukraine, but he's also, I think, to some extent a rational actor. And sooner or later, I think it's a question of convincing him that further sacrifices of Russian military and manpower and further sacrifices of Russian wealth are going to be counterproductive. And at that point, you could have a serious ceasefire negotiation, I think, which we have not had to date.
Well, with that, we've got to wrap this up. Thank you both for joining this episode of Impromptu.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
This episode was produced by Hadley Robinson and Regina DeHeer, edited by Chris Sulentrop, and mixed by Emma Munger. Special thanks to Millie Mitra and Deirdre Byrne. Thanks for listening to Impromptu. Please let us know what you think about the war in Ukraine. Send an email to impromptu@washpost.com. Talk to you next week.